At the very beginning of World War II, one man's vision and ability to see the true capabilities of a stealth machine could very possibly have changed the war's outcome to the Nazi regime's favour. His aim was to blockade the merchant shipping routes and stifle the British of their much-needed war supplies, food and other essentials. His weapon of choice could possibly be considered the world's first true weapon of stealth. These weapons were so intimidating that Churchill once stated, "They were the only thing that really frightened me." Join us this week as we investigate another interesting aspect of sea power. This is a modern battle group, and it represents today's most advanced naval firepower. This British group consists of many different vessels acting in unison to create a single unit. However, it is the aircraft carriers that are the major component of this fleet. Its role is to combine air power to the fleet's sea power. In this case, the aircraft are the Harrier jump jet and various helicopters. The other prominent vessel of the fleet is the submarine, and a fleet of this size may have more than one. The submarine's role has changed much, but one aspect remains the same. The submarine is a weapon of stealth. This fleet submarine contingent may be many miles ahead of the fleet and acting as the ears of the battle group. The submarine can be employed as a passive or aggressive member of the fleet. Today's modern submarine has a teardrop-shaped bow. This is a French Rubes-class submarine, which were built between 1986 and 1993. The teardrop hull design vastly improved the submerged speed of the submarine. Previous to this hydrodynamic improvement, submarines were not able to catch ships while submerged. Today, they have a greater submerged speed than surface speed and can easily keep up with the carrier battle group. Probably the most recognised class of teardrop-shaped submarines is the Ohio-class, which was featured in the Hollywood blockbuster Hunt for Red October. This single vessel has more firepower than all the bombs used throughout the entire Second World War. These submarines are often referred to as boomers and were designed in the 1970s at a cost of over $2,000 million each. They were, until recently, the most expensive submarines to be built. They carry 24 ballistic missiles. Seen here is the Trident C4 version. The Ohio class and its counterparts are perhaps the most deadly weapon of war to be built. They can strike with little or no warning under a cloak of extreme stealth.
Prepare one.
This is a test of a C4 Trident launch. The missile is ejected in a column of compressed gas. Upon reaching the surface, the missile fires the first of its 3 stages of rockets. The C4 has a range of over 4,000 miles, and the main missile holds 8 individual missiles, which can be independently targeted. Each of the 8 missiles has a 100 kiloton warhead, which is approximately 5 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Submarines today have many roles. They can sit quietly and passively, gathering information. They can attack enemy ships, both merchant and naval, or they can be used as nuclear strike platforms. Although submarines were used in World War I, their true potential wasn't realised until World War II. Admiral Donitz was in charge of the German U-boat campaign. He had served in World War I as a submariner and had first-hand experience of what a submarine could become capable of. Donitz maintained very close relationships with his captains. He would meet his returning crews and pass down the ranks and shake hands with each man and bestow medals. Both Donitz and his superiors believed the key to victory was to stifle the Allies' supply line. Donitz pushed forcibly to build and use submarines to cripple the supply lanes. However, his superiors saw more advantage with the traditional and proven battleship. Donat's insistence of the advantages of submarines lasted throughout the war. Over 300 submarines would have been needed to dominate the British Navy and break merchant supply lines. However, at the start of the war, Germany had a mere 28. These submarines were also inadequate to serve on the high seas and were mainly of coastal type classes. Both Grand Admiral Erich Rieder and Donitz knew the war was 6 years too early for the German Navy. However, with the limitations of U-boat numbers, Donitz showed incredible success in the Atlantic and North Sea. The world was not prepared for submarine warfare. The merchant ships were unescorted and scattered. They were easy targets. They were so easy that the U-boats would surface and give the ship's crew time to abandon ship before sinking the vessel with their forward-mounted guns. Throughout the early stages of the war, the U-boats continued unchallenged in their objective to block the shipping lanes. The only advantage at this time for the merchant seamen was speed. The U-boats could only intercept them. If sighted, the merchant vessel could easily outrun them. The first initiative to curb the high casualty count was the development of moving ships in convoys, which were escorted by destroyers and other fighting ships. Many merchant ships were also fitted with 4-inch or similar guns. However, anti-submarine warfare was still in its infancy, and losses remained high. In fact, Donitz created a new way to deal with convoys. He developed the wolf pack. When a convoy was sighted, the U-boat captain radioed its position, direction and speed to HQ, where Donitz and his staff plotted courses for other U-boats to also intercept. The U-boats would shadow the convoy by day and attack under the cover of night. The U-boats were slow when submerged. However, on the surface, they could reach 16 knots. The merchantman's only way of detecting a U-boat was visually, and at night, the low profile of the U-boat was difficult to see, which allowed the U-boat to close in on its target before diving. The wolf packs were extremely successful, and some U-boat captains were even able to slip into the convoy formation and attack within. This caused even greater confusion to the merchant vessels and their escorts. The losses of merchant ships continued into late 41. These losses could not continue for much longer, otherwise the war was lost. The English had to counter the U-boat threat. Within the U-boat fraternity, this period was known as the Happy Days. However, the tide was about to turn. Donitz's Wolfpack system heavily relied on radio communication, and this was the system's flaw. Radio directional fighting equipment was developed. The British were able to hone in on the direction of the Germans' radio signal, which lifted the U-boat's veil of stealth. But a bigger development was radar. The escort ships could now detect surface U-boats at much greater distances. Great advances in aviation also played a role in the U-boat's demise. The aerial coverage of shipping lanes was vastly increased, and spotter planes were also equipped with radar. Any surfaced U-boat at this time was in jeopardy. To add to the peril of the U-boat crews, the Americans joined the war and supplied Allied forces with even more radar-equipped aircraft to further broaden and intensify the search for surfaced U-boats. At the end of the war, the tally was 288 U-boat losses to air attack. An even more deadly tool was devised, the early sonar. An underwater sound pulse was sent out, and like radar, the return signal revealed the presence of the U-boat. Now they could be detected on the surface and hunted down while they were submerged. These developments were the birth of today's anti-submarine warfare. The total number of U-boats sunk or captured is approximately 780. Towards the end of the war, a U-boat was not expected to complete more than 2 missions before being destroyed. After Hitler's death, Grand Admiral Donitz was appointed head of state, and on May the 4th, he gave the order for U-boats to cease hostility. In a final address to his beloved U-boat crews, he stated, "My U-boat men, 6 years of warfare lay behind us. You have fought like lions. A crushing superiority has compressed into a very narrow area. The continuation of the struggle from the bases which remain. Unbroken in your warlike courage, you are laying down your arms after an heroic fight which knows no equal. In reverence memory, we think of our comrades who have died. Comrades, maintain your U-boat spirit in which you fought most bravely and unflinchingly during the long years." It was a fitting tribute to a brave and dedicated service of the 39,000 men who served in U-boats. 5,000 had been captured and near 28,000 killed in action. If Donitz had the quantity of U-boats at the outset of the war, it is very possible that Germany may have been able to cripple Britain by denying it much needed food, oil and military hardware supplies. Churchill confirms this when he stated, "They were the only thing that really frightened me." This is HMS Unseen of the RANS Upholder class of hunter-killer diesel-electric submarines. This class is an example of the early teardrop-shaped hulls. At this time, more computer and technically advanced weapon systems were being installed in submarines. These were a radical change from the early World War II vintage design. Perhaps of most interest is the class of submarine, which depicts the pinnacle of World War II submarine development. The Oberon-class is exactly this pinnacle. These submarines were very quiet for their day and stayed in service with various navies past the year 2000. At the time, they were state-of-the-art conventional subs, despite being based on a late World War II German hull design. The last of the O-boats in RN service were paid off during the 1990s. Australia purchased 6 Oberon-class boats from the United Kingdom and commissioned them Oxley, Otway, Ovens, Onslow, Orion and Otama. They served the RAN and Australia for 3 decades.
Open that main event. Open main vents. Full dive on the plane.
Over the years, many of the vessels were heavily modified in the weapon systems area. Further upgrades included the ability to fire Mark 48 torpedoes, which could carry a nuclear ordnance.
75 feet watch WW2.
Located at the Western Australian Maritime Museum is Oberon HMAS ovens. What is interesting is that the oven's final resting place is an actual World War II submarine slipway. This Australian city of Fremantle was the largest Allied submarine base outside of the United States. Ovens would be considered a medium-sized submarine. It is interesting to note that HMAS Ovens was only the second conventional submarine to fire a subsurface launched harpoon missile. Consequently, the boat's designation changed from SS to SSG. Entrance to the submarine is via a 30-foot high stairway, and the view over the area can only make the visitor ponder the landscape during the heady days of the Fremantle base during operations in World War II. Visitors enter through the forward hatch and descend the original ladder into the forward torpedo room. Guides take the people on a journey of a lifestyle that can only be described as very alien to most of us.
The empty ones. If there's no empty ones, they sleep on the floor.
Everywhere, bunks are found. What is equally interesting is the amount of work required to get the submarine and maintain it in such a pristine condition. The Western Australian Maritime Museum preserved the submarine in conditions that reflect the submarine's original specifications, and they continue to hunt for even the smallest part to make the submarine as authentic as possible. This is two of Oven's sister boats, Otama on the left and Orion on the right. Otama is bound for her last seagoing adventure. However, she will not sail this trip under her own power. Max Bryant, seen here, was in charge of overseeing the tow. Preparations included removing all hazardous waste from the vessel. All tanks, including fuel and ballast, had to be washed out and inspected. The Australian Navy offered their assistance to weld blanks on all the inlet and outlet openings in the hull. The submarine was then fitted with rigging required for its final 3,000-mile ocean journey. The tow took 13 days to complete, and adverse sea conditions had to be battled through the notorious waters of the Great Australian Bight and Bass Strait. Under maritime law, the Otama had to be towed unmanned. This meant that Otama was a dead ship without being able to assist in steerage, which added to this tense situation. Finally, the vessel arrived at Western Port Victoria, its final home. On a late summer's day in December, Otama slipped into the calm bay and was met by a crowd of curious onlookers and the organisers of the project. She remained hitched to the salvage vessel overnight, and early the next morning, with favourable tides, Otama was brought up the bay and moored at the town of Hastings.
Steering all right, Bob? Good, good. A gentle swing to port, please, Bob.
Once moored, work will begin to prepare Otama to be lifted from the sea and placed on land. In her new role, she will, like many other museum vessels around the world, serve to enlighten all who visit of the technical advancements of sea power, and most importantly, the bravery of the people who sailed such vessels past and present. Otama now has a new home, mission and crew. Surprisingly, some of her new crew are very familiar with the vessel. As a young man, David Hall was a cook on Otama, and on her arrival was keen to explore the vessel and seek out his old and familiar bunk. In this tiny kitchen, he prepared over 180 meals per day. His shift was 15 hours, 7 days a week. Otama closely resembles a World War II type vessel, and conditions on board reflect this. 2 toilet showers for 60 men. In the makeshift lighting of Otama, the cramped living is further accentuated. Every aspect of a submarine has procedure, even the way garbage is ejected from a specialized unit. The Oberons were possibly the most effective conventional submarine class of its time, with an astonishing reputation for quietness, which allowed it to exist in the 21st century. In fact, the ability of the U-boats to run in total silence enabled Australian submarines to successfully attack USS Enterprise, despite a huge number of supporting ships protecting it. The modern submariner and the modern submarine were born from the hearts and the metal of men and machines that have gone before. This is Sea Power. In this edition of Sea Power, we explore the advancement of anti-submarine warfare. In particular, we focus on the development of the submarine's natural surface nemesis, the destroyer. Both these vessels leapfrogged in development during the Second World War, and it's this development that we investigate in this episode of Sea Power. While the German army moved towards Warsaw, her powerful and determined navy headed out to do battle with Britain. Hitler's admirals were aware that taking command of the sea would see Britain fall. However, to control the ocean, the German navy would have to face off with the much more powerful British naval fleets. The German navy turned to the submarine as an auxiliary naval weapon to close the gap on the British advantage. Admiral Donitz was to prove that the submarine was indeed a most deadly weapon. He developed many techniques that enhanced the submarine's natural ability to sink ships. In this instance, a German U-boat is being refueled, reloaded and resupplied by another larger U-boat, called a milk cow. At the beginning of the war, Kriegsmarine, or German Navy, had no bases in other parts of the world, and the U-boats depended on supply vessels to keep them at sea. Surface vessels were too vulnerable, so the supply submarine was born. These were built around the successful Type 7 design. The milk cow's armament consisted of anti-aircraft guns only, as they were non-combatant units. The first of the 20 boats was put into service in 1941. All were sunk by Allied forces during the war. Operating a milk cow fleet allowed the fighting force to stay at sea for longer periods of time. England could not sustain the massive losses of merchant ships that the U-boats were inflicting. As the war began, England desperately tried to expand its merchant marine. But she also started to build the badly needed escort ships that would do what they could to stem the tide of losses to the U-boat attack. It was the destroyer class, and also the smaller corvette class of warship that was developed throughout the war to become the natural hunter of the submarine. The English were caught off guard by the start of the war and required time to gear up for this colossal production of merchant and naval vessels. While production was underway, the strengthening of the U-boat fleet was also undertaken by the Germans, and the U-boat contingent continued to sink merchant ships at an alarming rate. A breakthrough occurred in September 1941. Although not officially at war, the Americans decided to supply escort vessels for the Atlantic routes. The Canadian government had already agreed to supply escorts. Even with American and Canadian assistance, the escort fleet was not sufficient. The job of the escort ship was to patrol the outer edge of the convoy and to try to locate and destroy U-boats. This was a near impossible task at the start of World War II, as once the U-boat was submerged, there was little a destroyer could do in the way of detection. At the beginning of the war, some destroyers did have primitive hydrophones that allowed them to listen for submarines. It was widely argued that the advent of steam had rendered the convoy system obsolete. Many felt that the necessary delays involved in assembling vessels into a convoy would take up too much time. Another factor against the convoy system was fast ships were becoming restricted to slower ship speeds. Many captains feared such close manoeuvring would result in a high risk of collision, as well as presenting an easy target for submarine attack. The British Royal Navy felt that escort convoys was too defensive as a use for their ships, and continued to advocate independent hunting. As history shows, the use of the convoy system was indeed a correct decision, and it reduced losses to U-boats dramatically from the outset. In the meantime, the Germans had developed a devastatingly successful wolf-pack technique. When a U-boat spotted a convoy, they did not rush in for the attack. The U-boat simply trailed the convoy and radioed speed and heading information to HQ. Planners then organised groups of U-boats to attack simultaneously, which spread the escorts widely and made them even less effective. Although destroyers had hydrophones to listen for submarines as a method for detection, it was primitive and could not pinpoint a target. It was not till later in the war that more effective equipment was being used. In fact, the escort vessels were fighting submarine warfare with World War I technology. So the destruction of merchant ships continued. When America joined the conflict and the Japanese declared war, the submarine and destroyer would further battle each other and broaden the theatre of war on the high seas. The Americans used the submarine to attack the Japanese merchant fleets to prevent rubber, oil, and other wartime necessities reaching the Japanese military. At this time in the war, sonar and half-daff or radio detection finding apparatus had been developed, and anti-submarine warfare was coming of age. The Japanese destroyers could hone in on their underwater prey. No longer did the water's surface provide a cloak of invisibility for the submariner. Depth charging would continue for hours and was a grueling experience. Sonar provided exact locations, and it changed the game to the destroyer's advantage. The submarine still remained the most effective weapon to slow the supply lines, but the battle had become more equal. In all, the total loss of Japanese merchant vessels due to submarine attack was approximately 1,400 ships, or about 5 million tons. The ships included tankers with the valuable crude oil, troop ships, colliers, transport ships and naval vessels. By comparison, 52 American submarines were lost in the conflict. As anti-submarine warfare developed, the submariners of all nations found it harder to approach convoys without being detected. Once a torpedo attack began, the submarine was immediately harassed and forced to take evasive action, and the game of cat and mouse began. By the end of the war, the figures prove that the surface boats had a clear advantage. As of the 39,000 men who served the U-boats, 5,000 had been captured and near 28,000 killed in action. This is a Type 42 destroyer, also known as the Sheffield-class. The class was designed in the late 1960s to provide area air defence for the Royal Navy. In total, 14 vessels were constructed. 11 remain in service today. This vessel is representative of the development of the destroyer class after World War II and the different role they can play in today's Navy. The main weapon system of these destroyers is the Sea Dart and is a surface-to-air missile system. The Sea Dart is capable of Mach 2. The Sea Dart can be used in a limited fashion for surface-to-surface warfare. Although claimed to be obsolete, it is still effective against most modern missile threats, as proven by the 1991 Gulf War and the recent Iraq conflict. Targets are acquired by the ship's tracking radar systems and are then assigned to one of the tracker illuminating radars, or TIRs. The TIR fixes its target and the missile is simply fired. Two ships of this class were lost in the Falklands conflict, HMAS Coventry and HMAS Sheffield. The Sheffield fell to a French-built Exocet missile, which was fired from a low-flying aircraft. To improve the ship's defence capabilities against future missile attacks, the Class 42 were fitted with 2x20mm guns and 2x30mm guns. A modern representation of an anti-submarine ship can be found in the Netherlands' Kortenaar-class of frigate. It has a complement of over 160 personnel, and during the later stages of the Cold War, worked with other NATO navies to protect the Atlantic approach against the massive Soviet submarine fleet. This vessel is primarily a submarine hunter, and as such has a tremendous array of technical detection equipment. Both American and European companies manufacture the equipment. The first stage of any submarine hunt is locating the submerged target. The ship has a bow-mounted Westinghouse ANSQS 505 sonar, which is connected to the anti-submarine warfare data system. The data system collects information from the sonar and other systems and processes the information to give the operators the type, heading and depth of the acquired submarine. The submarine can be tracked and the ship can be directed to intercept. The information can also be immediately transmitted to the land-based headquarters or other surface vessels. In this modern world of technological marvels, some age-old systems are still employed. The Kortner is both fast and agile, and these attributes make it a very capable hunter. It has a top speed of 30 knots and a range of 4,700 nautical miles at 16 knots. This vessel is able to manoeuvre equally as well astern in most sea conditions, which is another requirement of a sub-hunter. Rolls-Royce Olympus and Tyne gas turbines are used in this class. The twin Olympus turbines create 56,000 shp to attain the vessel's top speed, and the Tyne engines, which output 8,000 shp, are used to give economy and range. The ship automatically switches from one engine to the other. Two Westland Lynx helicopters further add to the ship's ability to detect and destroy submarines. The hydraulic lockdown system enables the Lynx to be used in nearly all weather conditions. The helicopters have a range of over 300 nautical miles and have sonar capability and also carry anti-submarine weaponry. The Lynx can stay aloft for more than 3 hours. General weapons carried are 2 Mark 46 torpedoes, or Mark 27 torpedoes, or Mark 81 depth charges. The Lynx can attack submarines once it has located them by sonar. The helicopter simply dips the sonar equipment into the water to detect the presence of the enemy. It is also a much faster way to cover an area than using the ship alone. Weapons of the Kortner class include a 20mm Bova, 1x76mm Otto Breda gun, 4x12.75-inch Mark 32 torpedo tubes in 2 twin mountings, 8 launchers for Harpoon SSMs in 2 squad mounts, and 1 launcher for NATO Sea Sparrow SAMs, with a total of 24 rounds. Although built as a submarine hunter, 2 of this class were fitted out as anti-aircraft frigates. The Kortner class is now being joined by even more advanced vessels, which are now under construction. But the Kortner ships will remain in service for at least another decade. A classic example of a World War II escort vessel can be found in Australia. This is the former HMAS Whyalla corvette. Today, it's open to the public and stands as a tribute to all the crews of such vessels. It is also a story of the dedication it took to return Whyalla to its place of construction. The ship was to be taken from the water and taken 2 kilometres by road to her final resting place, the Whyalla Maritime Museum. This is quite a feat when you consider the ship's displacement weight is 659 tonnes and its length is approximately 57 metres or more than 200 feet. A cradle was built for the ship to rest on and steady her while on the road. With the cradle secured to the ship's hull, the vessel was manoeuvred to begin its ascent up the very slipway that she was launched from so many years ago. The original time frame to have the vessel moved to its new home was 3 weeks. However, disaster struck in the early stages as the ship at its cradle became stuck on the edge of the slipway. A tugboat was used to push the vessel and a fleet of tractor-power vehicles pulled the vessel in an attempt to free the Whyalla. Inch by inch, the vessel was edged further out of the water. It took 5 days to get the vessel's bow to break the high water mark. At this point, the effort became more difficult as the crew had to wait for high tide to continue the fight. In the end, it took 2 weeks to get the vessel clear of the water. The next step was to jack the ship up to a height of 1.5 metres or 5.5 feet to allow for the trailer to be fitted to the cradle. It took a further week's work to complete this task. With a number of trucks and earth-moving vehicles combining their horsepower, the vessel was finally moving. 220 tonnes of trailers and 328 wheels inched along the road in the final stage of the move. In January 1943, while in a deep inlet off New Guinea, she was attacked by 18 Japanese dive bombers and 6 fighters. In November 1943, HMAS Whyalla resumed escort duties off the east coast of Australia. In December 1944, she was engaged in minesweeping operations off the southeast coast of Australia. In 1945, HMAS Whyalla was attached to the British Pacific Fleet and formed part of the occupying forces that received the Japanese surrender of Hong Kong. She was paid off in May 1946 after steaming over 110,000 nautical miles during her wartime career. She continued in commercial service after the war and was modified. Today, the museum has nearly completed the restoration of returning her to her wartime specification. That concludes another episode of Sea Power. Join us again when we further explore this fascinating subject.